Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, the series where I speak to people who can help us to understand human decision making and what we can do to mitigate the risks it poses. As regular listeners to the show will know, the format I follow in this series is a free-flowing conversation. I invite guests on with interesting stories to share, and like normal human conversations, I let the discussion wander wherever it goes. I mention that because my guest this time, Professor Elizabeth Stokoe, specialises in exploring conversations. She's the Professor of Social Interaction at Loughborough University in the UK, and her research explores conversations, how they're structured, the language we use, and the ways in which we get our message across. I found Liz firstly through a book she wrote a few years ago called, appropriate enough, Talk, the Science of Conversation. There's a link to that in the show notes. And more recently, she's been actively looking at how the UK government has been communicating with the population when it comes to COVID. Her perspective, which she shares regularly on Twitter, is fascinating and thought-provoking. So I was delighted when she agreed to come onto the show to help me to understand more about her work. In our discussion, we firstly explore some of the key dynamics of conversations before moving on to COVID. I learned so much, and I know you will as well. Before we begin, a small request. If you like the series, please do leave a 5-star review for the show on whichever podcast platform you're using. It really does help. The more reviews there are, the more the platform algorithms promote it. That raises the profile of the show, which means more people can find and listen to it. That in turn helps me to attract guests to appear on the show. It really does help. So if you can, please do that small thing to help me to continue to grow the show in the way it has been. With all of that said, let's get on with this episode and my conversation with Professor Liz Stokoe on conversations. Liz, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hello.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And I wondered if you could introduce yourself to our listeners, because you have an absolutely fascinating job title, Professor of Social Interaction. So could you just let us know what that is and what your area of research involves?
Yes, I'm a conversation analyst, which most people have never heard of. I'm a psychologist by background. Conversation analysis is a discipline that's been around for 50 years or more. It started in sociology. It spread around into different disciplines, communication, linguistics, psychology. And its raison d'etre is to study life as it happens in the wild. So most social science, lots of psychology seeks to understand people by getting them to simulate their behavior. We experimentally produce their behavior. We ask them later about their behavior on scales or in interviews. Conversation analysis starts with recordings, often recordings that would have happened, of things that would have happened anyway, so not sort of set up by a researcher. And yeah, we study in fine detail the talk and other embodied aspects of interaction that comprise the encounters that make up everyday life.
Wow, that's just made me incredibly nervous in this conversation, because obviously I'm going to feel under huge scrutiny. But we will get past that particular nervousness. And you came to my attention as a result of COVID, and I do want to explore that a little bit going on. But I'm intrigued how someone gets into that career, because as you say, it's a sort of discipline that the more I read about it, the more I thought, well, it's obvious that should exist because it's really important and interesting to understand. And yet, it, as you pointed out, it sort of bounces around a multitude of areas and covers a range. So how does one get into that space?
I fell into it completely by accident. So as I mentioned, I did a psychology degree and then was applying for anything after my degree that had psychology in it. And one of the adverts that I responded to and was lucky enough to be offered a PhD studentship place was with a woman who was interested in the very early days of human-computer interaction in classrooms. So kids using computers to help them learn. And that was her area. And my project looked at university students interacting in tutorial settings where there hadn't been much work done on that. And my original focus was gender differences in a very traditional kind of way. I was going to look at, who talks more, who interrupts, and those kinds of questions. And it sort of morphed from there. So from psychology and I got into linguistics and sociolinguistics. But along the way, I just became quite dissatisfied with the thing that I could have written, which is a thesis which sort of showed that men and women taught differently in very stereotypical ways. But I wasn't really finding that in my data, but I was finding other interesting things with regards to how people maybe invoke aspects of gender and other identity things, and they become relevant to the unfolding of the interaction. And to do that, I was given a massive tome called Lectures on Conversation by my supervisor, huge thing. But the thing that made sense to me, having never come across anything like this before, was that all of the transcripts were of people talking in real life, not interviews, not surveys, not all the things that I'd been trained to understand as a psychology student. And so this kind of all fitted together. And I, was at least initially quite self-taught. Had a second supervisor who helped a lot. But it is a weird thing to get into. And I often tell people about the field who've never heard of it before. On the one hand, people don't know about conversation analysis. They will have heard of linguistics and psychology and lots of things that look a bit like it. But some of the foundational papers are amongst the most cited papers ever. And yet people don't know about conversation analysis as a discipline. So it is a weird one, but it's a great field to be in.
And so you're looking at, I guess historically would have been written down transcripts of conversations, but now obviously there's recordings available, and you're looking at those and saying, in essence, what's going on here? Is that the right way to look at this?
Yeah, I'm full of analogies. I'll try to hit all of them as we speak that I've used to sort of help people understand what it is that I actually do. Conversation analysis was born in the late 60s when recording devices became a thing. And so right from the start, some of the earliest studies were conducted in suicide prevention helpline interactions, actually. And so it was as soon as you could record things, that meant that you could record actual encounters, a lot of telephone stuff initially, which is great because in a way you don't have, at that point, you don't have to worry about what the implications of what people are doing with their bodies is because you're on the phone. And you could make transcripts. And so sort of the field got invented through the fact that the technology existed to be able to look at conversations after they'd happened in a lot of detail, and it sort of went from there. And one of my analogies is to try and think about interaction as both everyone is idiosyncratic to some extent, like our fingerprints, but we all have fingers and fingerprints, so we also recognize it. So interaction is idiosyncratic, but also highly systematic. So when you look across an entire encounter, especially when you look at the same sort of encounter, whatever that might be, a doctor-patient interaction or a sales call, or even just a domestic telephone call, when you look across lots of them, what you see from above is that they're comprised of the same activities. People move through them more or less smoothly. They might be frictionless or full of friction, but overall, the sort of macro organization of encounters is very systematic, even if the individual turns are full of idiosyncrasy, if that makes sense.
Wow. So in simple terms, we are in the same way that we are in terms of our decision making and behaviors. The way that we communicate follows predictable patterns, and so actually so reinforcing the point that we're maybe different, but we're all the same, and have certain sort of pre-programmed predilections. Is that right?
Yeah. So we're not behaviorists, and we probably don't talk about pre-program, at least in the way that I might have been trained in psychology. Instead, we look at or conceive of social interaction as sort of producing its own orderliness and reproducing it all the way through. But if I say to you, hello, most people will say hello back. In that sense, that's predictable. But you don't have to. So just because you do say hello to someone doesn't mean that they are going to say it back. And in those moments where if you say hello and people either don't hear you or they don't want to say hello back, what can sometimes happen is the first speaker will say hello. And in that moment, what they're doing is showing you it's not my interpretation, it's their interpretation that something was missing at that point. And then you might get that respondent to actually, oh sorry, I didn't hear you, or and the conversation will kind of calibrate itself all the way through like that. And so people will do fascinating things, like they'll start to say, what did you think about, how did you feel about X? So they start with a, what did you think about, and then just abandon it halfway through and they ask something else. And conversation is full of this. But all of those sorts of practices, when you're studying them in the cumulative kind of way that conversation analysis works, you start to see absolutely systematic ways in which people are oriented to things that they must sort of get right, if you like, as they go through the interaction.
And presumably if that doesn't happen, that causes us discomfort. So the example you've just given, I think of it sort of if somebody doesn't say sorry for some minor thing, we can get very, very upset about that. And as you say, there could be a million reasons why they haven't apologized. Maybe they didn't even realize they'd done something wrong.
Yeah.
But that seems to cause a huge amount of anxiety, because almost I've set up something where I sort of expect you to behave in a certain way. Either I've set it up or social conditioning would expect, and then that doesn't happen, and that leaves us feeling completely stranded.
Yeah, I think there's a lovely example of this, which will probably be very familiar, is when you feel like you're opening the door for somebody, or, at the moment, maybe social distancing from someone going by, and they seem oblivious, and like in that very sort of British way, you go, thank you, to yourself. But that's an example of just because you get out of somebody's way or hold the door open for them doesn't mean that they will say thank you. But in those little moments, we also show our kind of shared, the fact that you recognize that we all see that there's an absence there, and we sort of orient to it. So yeah. And I think the other thing is lovely. I used to use, when I was starting to teach conversation analysis, transcripts of the sitcom Friends, which I think is still very popular on Netflix and so on. I don't know how, it's very dated, I'm sure, but there's this lovely clip where they sort of do these breaches of conversational rules, if you like, all the time to generate humor. So there's a scene where somebody has, upset somebody else, and they go down to apologize, and they say, and they do this very fulsome apology, and the person they're apologizing just goes, okay, and shuts the door. And then this whole scene sort of unfolds where they say, I don't think I can accept your acceptance of my apology. It just doesn't seem like you really are accepting it in a genuine way. And he just says, okay, and shuts the door again. And so in those moments, you see, you couldn't laugh at that if you didn't understand that if you say, I'm really sorry, someone should say, don't worry, it's okay. And he doesn't do that. And so it generates humor. It's very funny.
And is this something that, we all know that languages are different and cultures are different. Do you notice, have you looked at this at all, but sort of the differences between different cultures and languages and how that plays out? Or is the fundamental underlying piece the same, even if it manifests itself slightly differently?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. And I personally work just with English data, which different versions of English data, but I can't. To do conversation analysis, you need to be really, really fluent in the language that you're analysing, because everything is so subtle. However, of course, lots of colleagues around the world have done conversation analytic research in lots of different languages, including cross-linguistic studies that show universal things that people around the world using different languages are still doing those same actions. And so conversation analysts, we tend not to start with what will the difference be in that traditional way, like what will make the difference to how people speak. Will it be gender, age, religion, nationality? We don't start with those factors. Instead, what we look at is what are the actions that comprise this complete encounter. And by action, I might mean greeting, request, offer, And when you start from action, then you start to see things like, well, of course, everyone will do a greeting, but they use different building blocks of their language to do it. Everyone is going to have to make requests of others, but how is it done? And then what you can show is that something like a request is a nice example, because you can do requests in so many different ways, but the action is the request. But you can say anything from, would it be possible for you to X, or I need X, or could I have an X, or just X, depending on who you're talking to. So we see that requests are designed in different ways, and what seems to be shaping those different designs isn't the things that we might think, like women make terribly polite requests and men are like, give me an X. That isn't, you don't see that. What you see is that people build their turns to create a request that is oriented to things more like, How important is it that I get this thing? How entitled am I to get this thing? How entitled am I to ask you to get me this thing? How easy is it for you to get me this thing? And all of those things you can see built in the design of a request. And then, of course, occasionally we see people making requests that might unfold in the conversation as they're not entitled to make such a pompous kind of request. I don't know if this makes sense to you, but I find it really fascinating that we teach children to say please, which is very important. Please and thank you, very important. Yet when you look at adult interactions, the polite requests or things that we would see as more polite very often don't have a please on the end. And in fact, a please on the end of a request can seem quite pushy. So, could you do X for me, please? Is a more sort of highly entitled request than I'm just wondering if it would be possible for me to do X. And those ones quite often don't have a please, and yet they actually sound more tentative and more polite, or a bit more thinking about whether the other person can do it or not. So we tend to assume all sorts of things about language and what it's doing. And quite often my job as someone who tries to do a bit of science communication here and there is to just bust those myths. Saying please doesn't make it polite. It can actually do the opposite in quite a lot of cases.
And I love that, because the number of times I've seen sort of polite reminder, gentle reminder, so words like that, polite and you sort of look at it and go, right,
polite notice. Yeah,
exactly. And you sort of go, just because you've used that word doesn't make it the thing you. And actually, you've irritated the hell out of me, because and I know what the game is here. Yeah. And in many, I was going to say, actually, before you made the point about the polite notice, is that it seems to me there's a difference between the written word and the spoken word. But actually, there's a really good example of polite notice. It's a totally ridiculous word.
Yeah.
And sits there and sort of achieves precisely the opposite objective. So in many respects, actually, I'm gonna negate my own point in a way, unless you tell me, right, that actually this thing does flow across into the written word as well as the spoken word.
It really does. So I'll say something about that, just to say something about, in case anyone thinks that I'm advocating not teaching children to say please. The point is a bit more sophisticated than that, because of course it's really important to teach children to say please and thank you. But what you might be also thinking about is that what is it that you're doing by focusing on things like please and thank you, and when you see those adult interactions where please seems passive aggressive, if you like, or pushy, versus the very tentative requests that don't have a please. It's what you're actually doing is teaching children about their entitlement to ask for things and how important it is for them to get this thing right now. So there was an article a couple of years ago where people were worried about the Alexa devices and so on, where somehow this was really problematic because children were able to say to Alexa, turn the TV on, without saying please, and this was a huge problem. But and I think that it just missed the point that you're not teaching children to say please for the sake of always saying please for everything, because we know as adults that saying please can be this rather passive aggressive thing. But what we are doing is saying you have to design your requests for the who you're talking to and how important it is and all that kind of stuff. When it comes to the written word, you can really see this as well. So I had a PhD student, Jo Meredith, a few years ago, who looked at people she live screen captured people composing Facebook Messenger chats, so she could look at it just between friends to try and compare that to, there's lots and lots of studies and data in our world where people are looking at friends just talking to each other on the phone. So she wanted to see, well, what happens, what can we say about the written versus the spoken mode? And what she found was that, again, if you don't start with what's the difference between speaking and writing, and instead start from what are people doing, what are the actions, then you see all of the same kinds of things at play in the way people are writing their messages. What's different and what's really gorgeous is that in writing, we see what they wrote and didn't post. So the example that I gave you earlier, where someone might say, what do you think about, how do you feel? In talk, you can't hide the fact that that first bit came out. You just cut it off and start again. Whereas you see in these messages, people will write, how did you think? What did you think about? And then the cursor will blink for a bit, and then they'll delete it, and then write, what did you feel? And then, of course, the recipient only sees the correction. And she had some lovely examples of people agonizing about how many kisses and, so you have this little screenshot of somebody writing 5 X's, and then the cursor would sort of sit there for a bit, and then they delete 2, and then it would sit there again, then delete them all, and then they put like a sticky out tongue emoji instead. And you're just thinking, what would that have looked like in real life?
But I find that fascinating because and it may be because I do a podcast, I tend to listen to myself probably a bit more than the average person. But if I transcribe or write down some of the sentences, it is full of that, starting things, jumping around, moving, which when I look at it written down, it just sort of looks utterly incoherent. And yet it seems to work, he said, because people listen to this podcast, it seems to work as a communication device. And yet from a very logical flow perspective, if I published a book in literature, people go, this is an idiot talking. And actually it seems to work as a rhetorical device verbally, but not necessarily written down. Fascinated by that distinction.
Yeah. When people first see a conversation analyst transcript, which it's very punishing, if you like, if you see your own talk transcribed and you see, crikey, I'm all over the place. But you're not, as you say, we are building, taking turns, building courses and sequences of actions, and it's absolutely not a problem. And as we're going along, we're calibrating almost everything that comes out of our mouths, depending on what the other person just said, and that's completely normal. And I think it's that one of the reasons why we balk at the idea of spoken talk being so messy and so full of ums and ahs and hesitations is because we do have this slightly strange view of what would count as a fluent speaker or a really good speaker. So I was lucky enough a few years ago to give a TED talk, and it was a tremendous success in as much as lots of people have looked at this TED talk. But the negative side of that is that people will comment on it. And so I had an email from somebody shortly after it was released on YouTube, basically time-stamping every single So they wrote to me and said, you said at all of these points. And I sort of went back and looked at it. And of course, then I just thought, my God, I'm just so not fluent. I thought I was very fluent at the time. It was so well rehearsed. And I felt really, really, like the pin had come out of the balloon on that. And then I spoke about, and this guy who wrote to me said that he was from Toastmasters and that, you really need some training in public speaking. Anyway, I mentioned this in an interview a few years later. And then I got an email from somebody from Toastmasters saying this, that they were absolutely mortified that someone would have written to them, and the idea of, that the spoken mode is like that and the written mode is typically not like that. And it was a very nice sort of end to the story. It made me feel like, okay, not all humans are horrible to other humans. But I think when it comes to, I think an interesting point where these things come together is script writing for the telly and drama and stuff, and what looks like an authentic dialogue. And Woody Allen films are often praised for sounding so authentic, almost improvised, or an improvised kind of script, and then they seem very natural. And what is it that? Well, it's because they're not all tidied up. They're not all tidied up for delivery every time, and so that's where I think the talking and the writing kind of comes together. In acting and role play, where you can see this sort of strange dialogue, which isn't really quite like real life because it's been tidied up.
To pick sort of 2 recent examples, and without necessarily getting into the politics, although feel free if you want to. If I compare Barack Obama, who's a very compelling orator, and with his successor, who you could argue on the one hand is not particularly coherent, and yet seems to resonate with a certain audience. Now, if you put them next to each other, there is one of the two you would say very eloquent, and the other one is not. But they resonate with people in very interesting ways. And in some cases, you sort of might say, well, maybe they're different audiences. But I find it fascinating that both of them manage to communicate very, very different ways. And one of them, I think, sticking to the rules, you might say, the other one breaking all those. But both seem to be equally effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think... obviously speaking very precisely, carefully, in an evidence-based way, might characterize how Barack Obama spoke. And Donald Trump kind of made a virtue of speaking like the apparently ordinary person. I've transcribed bits and pieces of Donald Trump's oratory, just for sort of almost. I transcribed the woman person cameraman TV. That one I thought because it was just so funny. But I mean, of course, it's not just about how you say it. It's the stuff that you're saying as well, of course, in especially in politics. But I am fascinated by people's sort of evaluations and assessments of politicians and the way they talk. So, for example, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson is quite posh, and people, his oratory, at least, and perhaps until recently, was seen as this oratory, this great oratory. Yet he is so full of ums and ahs and stumbles and resets, and people do pick that out now. But we also, I'm fascinated when people. Who are people evaluating? So people evaluate Priti Patel for not saying the G's on the end of her words, and perhaps they don't focus on another politician who might actually be speaking in similar ways that others might find problematic. So all of that becomes interesting with regards to gender and public life, and what do we think is the right way to talk as a politician, which is kind of fascinating. I'm not a fan of the Tory party, but nevertheless I do find these ways of assessing how people talk, how women talk, how men talk, apparently, and then what you get is just loads and loads of generalizations and stereotypes.
I can only imagine. And I was reflecting on the comments on the TED Talk, and just sort of thinking, who does that? I mean, somebody has sat down and bothered to do that. But it's in the context of what you were talking about there, that's an attempt to influence you. And I talk a lot about, many of my listeners work in compliance, which I talk about the business of influencing human decision making. We don't think about it in those terms, but that's what you're trying. So, and as I sort of reflect on conversations, each one is you're trying to achieve something in that conversation, to persuade someone, to get them to do something. And so if I reflect on that particular interaction, I sort of, what is the intended outcome there? Because if you're writing something along those lines, you're not going to sit there and go, oh, thanks. That's really, particularly given your discipline, it's clearly not designed to be desperately helpful. And I'm fascinated by this sort of, why does one launch into that sort of conversation? What do you hope to achieve? It's a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm intrigued as to whether your thoughts on, it's probably very difficult because you're involved in the process, but why would someone do that? What's the purpose of that conversation? And we have lots of conversations, I think, that are useful, but there's plenty of conversations where I go, what's the point of that? What are you trying to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's really odd. But of course, I presume that people have always had this sense of, I want to correct somebody else, and I feel entitled to do that. And I feel, therefore, that I know more than them about something. And the internet has just made that really possible for everybody all the time. So it's just such a common thing that we do. I mean, it's interesting when it's not anonymous. I mean, you can understand when people are anonymous, they can, they have that sort of de-individuated, I'll just say something and it doesn't matter because I'm anonymous. And we all know how full of conflict and aggression social media can be. So it is especially strange to get an unsolicited email from somebody whose name is actually at the end of it to you, and kind of wonder what you're meant to do with that. I just filed it and didn't reply. And that's the advice that we give to people, isn't it? Don't feed the trolls, or just don't respond to people who, do things like that. I mean, I've had quite a few experiences like that. And yeah, you are left wondering, I'm not sure what you want me to do with this. I felt awful for quite a long time. And I did a talk the next year at the Royal Institution, and I rehearsed it so much. And the two videos, they are a bit different. I don't have any ums in it at all, but it's, that's not very natural in a way. And the other thing, which is kind of ironic really, is that research in my field shows that people's ums and ahs are not random. So of course we might do an when we're showing to the person that we're talking to, hang on a minute, I'm just thinking of where I'm going to go next. So it serves an absolutely practical function. So the idea that someone is just saying means that they don't have, that they're stupid, or they just can't have the answer, or they don't know, is really not borne out by empirical studies of where ums and ahs tend to happen. And I did some research with colleagues last year where we were looking at what's the difference between a mystery shopper, so somebody who is simulating being a user of a service, telephoning a service, and a person who is genuinely using the service. And one of the things that we found was that the ums and ahs in the request for the service are in different places, depending on whether you really are a customer or whether you are acting like a customer to test out whether or not the service is any good. And who would have thought that?
Wow. So it's because that's interesting, because it's not a situation where you're having to fake it in the sense of, I don't know, undercover cop type situation where clearly that's quite stressful, or I don't know, Sacha Baron Cohen being Borat, right? Those sort of situations. But this is actually, you're doing something that it doesn't require much acting. You're just doing what you normally do, and even then, you're saying that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite interested in the differences between simulated or role-played interaction, especially where there's an outcome, like so someone is doing a sort of oracy skills exam, or a simulation where they have to pass it in order to, the first of that I did was looking at police officers interviewing actors playing the part of suspects on a course to see whether they would pass the course and so on. And because I'd already done some research on police interviews, the real ones, if you like, with suspects who might go to prison at the end of all of this, it was really fascinating to look at, well, what happens when it's actors who, of course, their stake in that encounter is totally different from someone who might end up in prison. They're just going to go home and, collect the paycheck sort of thing. So I looked at the police officers delivering the most scripted part of that encounter, which is basically going through the legal requirements of things like, informing who's in the room and the date and where we are and all those things. And I looked at them in the real encounters and then the simulations. And you might sort of wonder how different can it be to inform somebody that they are entitled to free and independent legal advice? But the answer is it's quite different depending on whether you're role playing in a role play or you're in the real thing. So that was my interest. And then I moved this into looking at the mystery shoppers. And this is a world where people will phone up, it's very common, and to test out a service. There's a lot of work in the pharmacy and chemist industry where a mystery shopper will go into a chemist, ask for a drug, and then see whether or not the pharmacist does all of the checks to see whether or not they can actually give this to this particular person. And what we don't know anything at all about is, but does the mystery shopper make the request in the same sort of way as someone who really wants the drug? It's just an assumption that it would be the same. Like,
it's a really good point.
Why wouldn't it be? And so then you've got people kind of being assessed on their ability to provide service and all the rest of it, with no sense of what was the initiator, what are they responding to, and just assuming that if you tell someone what to say, they'll say it and that'll be fine. So in the study where we looked at how it was in the world of vets. So we looked at mystery shoppers phoning the vet about their sick animals, or their animals that need a jab, and then real pet owners. And the very first thing that we found was that real pet owners never phone up to find out the price of a service, but the mystery shoppers regularly do. And the mystery shoppers don't phone up to make an appointment because, I mean, they could, we could actually train them better. But basically, the mystery shoppers don't phone up to make an appointment, whereas many people with an animal do phone up to make an appointment. And so if you're phoning someone to make an appointment, then you can look at, does the person on the phone progress that request in a really good way, effective way. But if the basic call is how much does it cost to get the jabs, and here's the answer, and that's the end of it. And I've got some nice examples where the receptionist will say, would you like to make an appointment? And like, well, I might phone back, the mystery shopper who hasn't really got a dog. So I'm sort of thinking, well, what can you actually say with any kind of validity about the experience that you're getting as a mystery shopper when you're not asking for the same thing in the same way? You're not phoning up sobbing. You're not giving the same interactional tasks. And yet, one assumes that mystery shopping services are there to give feedback on organisations about how well their staff are doing. And I just find that really problematic.
That's really interesting because it's all, now you put, it's one of those lovely things. Now you point it out, it's blindingly obvious, but probably wouldn't have occurred to me if I was trying to set that. So this isn't sort of nefarious mystery shopping companies. This is genuine. This is a perfect. It's almost a great example of behavioural science point of. It's a very logical approach. Well, we'll just put someone else in that position. But as you rightly point out, human beings behave very differently according to the dynamics and the environment and their own personal circumstances. And I'm fascinated by that it drives conversation to that extent, because you would sort of think, because it's almost the obvious criticism would be, well, it's very difficult to pretend to be something you're not, but we'll get as close as we can. That would be okay. Yeah. And implicit in what you're saying is actually it's not. We're missing a whole load of things there because I guess it is, it's as simple as saying we can't fake it in many respects. And therefore a lot of what we do, you need a level of authenticity to get close to the point.
Well, I think the reason why the mystery shopping stuff was so interesting is because from my point of view, I know who the mystery shopper is, but from the person taking the call, they don't. So when you look at these calls, and if I showed them to somebody who hasn't got this stuff in mind, they wouldn't spot a mystery shopper. What they might spot is somebody phoning up for a price, not really think anything of that, watch the receptionist, see whether they wanted an appointment, and that's the end of the call. And there's nothing special about that in a way. And of course, it's massively trading on the fact that one party doesn't know that the other party doesn't really want this information for the same reason that somebody who really does want the information. So from a distance, these calls look absolutely fine. It's only when you look at a larger corpus and you start to look at the differences that you see, oh yeah, they're actually really quite different. And so I think the assumption is, one of the reasons that something like mystery shopping exists and role play, which is, it's just such a huge juggernaut of this is how we train and assess people's communication skills, is that we can just do that, or that it's not really going to make that much difference. And we just assume it, and it hasn't really been tested out as to whether there's any evidence behind that assumption. And so the mystery shoppers, they did things that you might think are not really that important. I just find them fascinating because it's what I study. But it becomes consequential. So the thing that I think is consequential is that if the mystery shopper never gives the task to the receptionist of having to navigate an appointment system and meet their need, then you can't say anything about the service. And that feels important. Things that I find fascinating that everyone else might find less important, but they are there, is that mystery shoppers are more likely to phone up to ask for information about, I've just bought a puppy. So using the indefinite article, a puppy. Whereas real pet owners are much more likely to say, I'd just like to find out if I can get an appointment for my dog, using the possessive pronoun. So little differences like that. They're totally logical in a way, aren't they? But the mystery shopper who doesn't have a connection to this mythical animal might just say, I'd like to find out about something for a dog. Whereas people who have the animal will say, my Labrador called Brownie. They'll build the request in quite different ways. And when it comes to those ums and ahs, we don't have masses and masses of data, but what we noticed was that the real pet owners are more likely to stumble and do those ums and ahs as they produce the service that they're asking, but not in the production of their dog. So they might say, I'd like to make an appointment for my dog Brownie for its vaccinations. It's vaccinations. Whereas the mystery shopper is more likely to stumble as they produce the type of animal that they're phoning for, but not about the vaccination. So I'd like to make an appointment for a dog for its vaccinations. and so wow. You see that type of difference. And to be honest, you only see it if you're transcribing it in a lot of detail. And for the person on the end of the phone, they might think, God, they seemed a bit weird, because we do think that about people. And I think that's how we sort of get away with a lot of this stuff. It just seems a bit weird, but what they're not thinking, I bet that was a mystery shopper, because we just don't operate like that.
Well, yeah, because it'd be exhausting if we had to.
Yeah, it
would. Speaking of being exhausting, I'm fascinated by how this impacts you and your interactions with others, because what you've just described, in common with many sort of anybody else researching a specific subject, is you've got a lens now, or a pair of ears, I guess would be better, that allow you to see. You can observe things that the rest of us can't because you spend. Does this change how you interact with others? Are you more thoughtful about how you say things? Are you paying more? What has it done to you as a person?
I don't know, I feel like you'd have to ask people in my life that question. I think probably because when you're talking, even though this is a sort of semi-formal interaction and that I'm thinking about it and trying to be as careful and precise as possible, nevertheless, the task of a conversation analyst is to show later that all of the tacit things that you're not really aware of when you're interacting, but were actually making a difference to that encounter. So my job is to look at conversation analysis in slow motion. And so I'm not producing it in that kind of way. Of course, so for myself, I don't think I'm,
could you say to someone, could you just slow down a bit so that I can analyze
I don't think I'm especially effective in that sense, but of course, what I am doing sometimes is analyzing everybody else's interactions in meetings or in a message. And the thing is, though, we're all doing that to some extent. Of course, we're all like when we hold the door open and the person just swans through, and the fact that we would get thank you, shows that we're analysing all the time. We couldn't, if we weren't analysing, we wouldn't, any of us, be able to take any turns in conversations at all, because in order to take a turn, you have to have analysed and identified that the other person's finished speaking, that they did something that I can respond to, that it's my turn to respond and not anybody else's. So we're analysing all the time, actually.
Speaking of analysis, I'm fascinated to the extent that you are able and want to talk about this. As look at COVID and what we're seeing at the moment, because I think communication has become a really powerful tool. And I was reflecting on the fact that actually, because the amount of human interaction has gone down, we're getting a lot more information in 2D form, in very simple, through screens.
Yeah.
And I suddenly realized actually all of my communications with people are coming through a screen, so even friends and people I chat to. My communications with the authorities. So there's we're in a very interesting period where it's more important than ever, particularly given what's going on, to communicate. And so I'm fascinated by your sort of, I'll throw it out there broadly, say thoughts on what's happening at the moment and how communication is playing a part in that.
Yeah. Well, there's a few different things that we could talk about. One of them, of course, is what we're doing now, which is interacting online. And I think it's really fascinating that in a way, COVID has amplified lots and lots of things that were pre-existing about the world, whether that be the state of health systems, the fact that, we already had services that were stretched, all of the inequalities, all of those things have been exposed further by the pandemic. When it comes to interaction, we were already doing a lot of stuff online, of course, but we didn't have to, or we didn't have to in the same kind of way that we have to now. And so I think it's important to remember how much of life is augmented by technology these days, and what one can have opinions about that either way. But I think, for me at least, one of the things that I've tried to do is at least remind people that just because you're talking on Skype or Zoom, we tend to, it's kind of led to assertions about interaction online that, again, are the same kinds of things that people assert about body language or interaction that aren't empirically based anyway. So one of my favorite communication myths is that communication is 90% body language. People will, or 70%, 70% body language and 30% words. These stats are very prevalent in communication training. And not only did the person who is often cited as writing the original study back in the 60s, not only has he campaigned with a colleague in my field, actually, Max Atkinson, they wrote together, campaign against the Morabian myth, because that's not really what he found, or at least it wasn't ever designed to have that kind of simplicity to it later. And Max Atkinson talks about how the fact that it can't be true, because how could you ever talk to someone in the dark? Yeah, or how could you have a conversation with someone who's downstairs and you're upstairs, or how could you talk to someone on the phone, or how could you talk to, or how come you can't talk to someone in France if you don't speak French? Because if it was 90% body language, right, you'd be fine. So of course, it immediately is, when you think about it, you think, well, that can't be true. But that whole issue of the body language myth translates perfectly to the situation we're in now. So your listeners are hearing the audio, but we're face to face, if you like. And so you're actually getting a lot more information than you would from the audio. It's not the same as being in person, but we actually are able to do a hell of a lot of stuff. Again, when you start with action, what are people actually doing online? And the other thing that I think is really important is that this notion that you can't do anything subtle with technology when you're in a video call like this. Of course, your broadband speed and all those things really matter, but just put that to one side for a minute. One of my favourite early encounters in lockdown was with, I don't know if they're going to be listening to this, but it was my aunt and my dad. And my dad has been a bit grumpy, and my aunt and I, we could see that he was sort of looking, I think he was looking at his phone, so he was looking away like this. And at the same time, me and my aunt just eye rolled each other down the camera because we knew he wasn't looking. So of course you can do stuff like that. And and then you think, well, you can't do that if there's 10 because then you don't know who you're looking at. And of course that's true, but it's also equally difficult to do subtle stuff if there's 10 people in the room in person. Right. I think it's just important to think about what is it that you're doing, and also what is it that you're asserting, and is that really the case? And the final thing about this particular aspect of COVID is the idea that you can't do stuff online because somehow you're not able to build a relationship in the same way. I just think we need to think about the overall arc of technology. And for example, would we say that the Samaritans who operate on the phone are not able to build relationships with people because they're on the phone? And that doesn't make sense at all either. The first technology... Right,
because they've saved tons of lives by intervening, yeah.
Yeah. And I just think, if we just think, well, we used to have the phone and we got a hell of a lot of life lived, the bits that we need to do it on the phone. I'm not saying that I would not love life to be 3D by and choose all the bits that I want back in 3D. But I think we shouldn't just assert things about online interaction that actually aren't empirically true.
Fabulous. Well, you're on a roll. Keep going on the COVID themes because that was a brilliant opener. I can't wait to hear where we go next.
Okay, well, I'll say a couple of other things. One of them is about something. So I noticed this quite early on about social distancing and how people were sort of navigating these new norms. And I'm a very slow jogger but a frequent walker. I'm out a lot, so I was sort of noticing people swerving or not swerving, mutually swerving, clocking each other from a distance and readjusting their arc across the field and all those sorts of things. And so one of the things that people asked me, and I've written a few bits and pieces of sort of guidance on this, what do you do if somebody is not socially distancing from you? Or what do you do if someone's not wearing a mask and you're the person that wants them to do both things? We tend to immediately reach to a guidance that is more active and therefore potentially more confrontational than it needs to be. So you could say to somebody, could you move, please? But as we've already said, could you move, please? That could immediately come off rude because I'm wondering if it would be possible for you to get out of the way, but you might not have time to do that. So in fact, anyone can try this out. I did it this morning on my walk in the woods, where if someone's coming, then if you stop and just wait for a minute, and as soon as they notice you're there, then they'll see that you've done something a bit strange, but you haven't asked them to do anything, and then people will just alter their courses. So you can do it with a smile on your face, absolutely minimal verbal exchanges at all. It's all done through the body, and you can get people to do the thing by not asking them at all, but showing them that you're expecting them to do something if they haven't noticed you already, and then they'll just move, and that of course is far less confrontational. The other thing is if you sort of have to verbalize something, is to offer things rather than request things. So it's much easier to say to somebody, like this happened to me in the summer where we were still all doing social distancing, but I had a great builder who was doing some bits and pieces in the back garden. And I just didn't want to deal with the social distancing issue. So when he sort of came round into the back garden to look, I said, I'll just give you a bit of space. And because I didn't want to get into, could you move? I had no idea what he was going to do, but I just thought, well, I'll offer it. And that's much easier. And again, it's much easier to offer somebody, oh, do you need a mask? Rather than say, I want you to wear a mask, because if people are already not social distancing or already not wearing a mask, then anything that you do is going to be some kind of temporary intervention on their trajectory. And so you kind of presumably want it to be as least, to minimize the friction. And one way to do it is that's why I really like the just pausing for a minute and waiting for someone to sort of self-correct, rather than sort of making it a big topic, because that can just lead to confrontation. So I think this is nice, because some of the things that we immediately think we must do as guidance isn't actually the right thing to do. You're going to probably generate more conflict than the more subtle things that sound too subtle, but they really work. So yeah,
that's actually someone did that to me earlier today. Actually, I was on a staircase and navigate, and and you're right, it's weird. And I was like, what are they doing? And I immediately became suspicious. But I had to deal with. It was kind of like, it's up to me to do something now. Yeah. And I almost ran away. It was just weird. Not that I was doing anything wrong, listeners, I hasten to add. But that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's much easier, isn't it, than, it's much easier to, this observation was absolutely live for me, because I was sort of running along a fairly narrow road where on one side is a reservoir, on the other side is a wall. So there's nowhere to go. And the road's probably about 3 meters wide. And there were a couple of cyclists, and they were socially distanced from each other at a junction, sort of talking across. And I needed to, but I thought, well, I don't really want to go through the middle of them because it was quite a narrow gap. But what I did was I sort of just slowed down and just kind of waited for a bit and sort of smiled, and they noticed me and they were like, oh, and they both just moved out of back a bit, and then I just went through the middle, and it was completely smooth and without friction. And that was in sharp contrast to a really horrible experience where I was actually coming along the same stretch of road, and behind me were 3 blokes on bikes straddling the whole road, coming down quite fast. And this was quite early in the pandemic, and I was probably, now I would probably just turn away and just hold my breath a bit, or whatever. But because I could tell they weren't going to remotely get into single file or do anything like that, I said, oh, could you just move over a bit, please? And they just swore at me in a really aggressive way, and it was horrible. But in a way, it tells you that in some instances, you just have to probably decide not to do anything, or just do something, like turn away and hold your breath away. I don't know. It might sound a bit ridiculous, but actually what that shows is that the subtler intervention that minimally imposes on the other person is quite effective.
And I think that sort of plays into, so you've been quite vocal, should we say, online. I know you've participated in various sort of COVID advisory pieces. And I'm fascinated because that thread of thinking about what drives humans and what motivates them and why are people doing the things that we don't want them to do, and how can we get them to, is entirely consistent with what you just said, which is this idea of we need to have a huge degree of understanding of what's going on here. And let's look at the underlying dynamics and not make presumptions around people's behaviors and make it easier for them. And I love that, because the examples you've given there work on an individual level as we encounter things through our daily lives. But that same principle seems to me, based on a lot of things that you've said and others have said that I agree with, is that we can, if we look at society and say, why are we not getting the outcomes we're looking for? There are going to be drivers there that have, rooted in a lot of the things you've been talking about now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things, it's also very fraught, isn't it? Because we're right in the moment of it. But looking at whether or not people are complying with guidance and adhering to the rules and stuff, the social distancing one itself is very interesting, because when you look at the current government guidance on social distancing, it's not as clear as you think it should be. So if the guidance isn't clear, then it's not as easy to comply with because it's not clear. So it's not that clear to me what you should do outside when you look at the guidance, 2 meters, and then there are some caveats. Whereas if we just said 2 meters everywhere and everyone tries to get that, then that becomes much clearer. And when it sort of moved down to 1 meter plus, I was thinking, oh, this is awful, because for a start, 1 meter is about your standard distance from people, unless
because otherwise you'd be weird in normal times. Right?
Yeah. So the idea of 1 meter plus, and then how good are people at estimating 2 meters? And actually, what you probably should do is add a bit more to it so that you actually achieve 2 meters for the people who can't estimate 2 meters. Very, very, and it's not that easy to do. We're not used to that sort of stuff. But and of course the best example of this is the difference between stay at home and stay alert. And at that point, the messaging Stay at home, it's so precise. It's precise in terms of its words and its grammar. We actually all got a text message which was even more precise: you must stay at home. So expressing a requirement and being explicit about the subject of the instruction, which is you. And then stay alert is just a message built for imprecision. You know,
that's a great phrase. Yeah. I love that, built for imprecision.
But it's got that. It's the same grammar. It's 2 words: stay home, stay alert. But of course, what you've now got is alert being not a precise place, but a sort of imprecise adjective. It's a cognitive state. It's subjective. It's open to interpretation. And when we were analysing this at the time, you know, something like 65% of people said they didn't understand it, compared to 90% of people saying they understand stay at home. And then across the arc of the pandemic, you know, things, when you're in national lockdown like we are now and stay home, that's much easier to understand than all of the tears and all of the mess that sort of happened in the middle, where you would even get headlines with, you know, chiefs of police saying that they couldn't articulate the difference between the tears, and then he's not saying they didn't know the difference. And, you know, and it's very, this idea that we need clear messaging so that people can understand it, so that they can do the thing that it's meant to be conveying. And of course, they need to trust the source of the message as well. And they need to understand the reason behind the message as well. So there's all of these kinds of things. But if people don't understand, you know, what a face cover is, if the instructions, for example, about face coverings aren't clear, then when you still occasionally see people with a visor but no mask, they're likely to think of themselves as adhering to the guidance. And if the guidance, because we don't talk that much about face coverings anymore. We have hands, face, but what do they all mean? Does everyone still know what all of those things actually refer to? There was an example of I think face somewhere in the middle, where a council had put on its website, face meant don't touch your face, which of course isn't what it means. It means wear a face covering. but you don't see what I mean. So hands, face is very catchy. But unless you already know exactly what each one of those things is meant to instruct you to do, then it's branding and sloganeering above precision. And I think there's lots of examples of that. I think, my favourite one, partly because it's to do with universities and I work in one, but students were told when they had their travel window at the end of last year not to use public transport. But the Department of Further Education's advert to students about how to travel home for Christmas, a beautiful animation, showed a train going across a snowy landscape. And you're just thinking, well, it looks great, but you're basically saying travel in a snowy landscape on a train in the student travel window. But the guidance said students should only use public transport as a last resort.
But I think, there's so many interesting things there that we could dissect for hours. But I'm fascinated by this idea of actually those instructions. That is a form of, it's a communication, because in many cases, there's the law is one thing, but obviously the view, you could take a view on the law and say, what's my likelihood of getting caught and how will they get, all that. So you could take a very sort of simple, calculated approach to it. It relies on people's goodwill and for people to understand and use and a lot of times, as you say, to use your common sense. Because if you literally sort of applied my favorite Viz character, Mr. Logic, and you sort of just literally you'd end up with some terrible unintended consequences if you did exactly what it said all the time. There are times when you need to stretch and think and be flexible. So there's a quality of compliance, if you like. And I'm struck very much as you were talking about individual conversations and how we interact with those. There is all of these things are a form of conversation between the authorities, whether that's the health service or the government and more general, and us. And so the dynamics that we have at an individual level seem to also apply at that larger level. It's the same thing. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. The whole world is just made up of millions and millions of conversations. I think for me during the pandemic, one of the things that is really difficult, this is frustrating, all the time, but it's more frustrating now. And that is how quickly a narrative takes hold that is incredibly hard to cut through, despite evidence on the ground of different situations happening, and of course that's true for everything. But the idea that you would, for me, the recent one that frustrates me is lots and lots of headlines about schools shut until, I'm like, hang on, schools are open. They're not only open a little bit. My partner in his school 100% of the teachers are in, teaching 50% of the kids, because that's about how many kids are in school at the moment, legitimately in school through the various categorizations. So, but the idea that schools are shut, no one's really interested in what's actually happening on the ground. And then you just get these incredibly powerful narratives that are so difficult to cut through. And I think that is what, no matter what side of all of anything you're on, whether it be Brexit or how you feel about the pandemic or just anything really, that everything, once something takes hold, the empirical reality of it all kind of becomes secondary, and people are interested, and it's very easy to say, well, that's just a one-off. And maybe this is partly why I'm interested in studying conversations, because I'm looking at everything that happens at the most minute detail. And so I know what happens in people's everyday actual encounters, what it's actually like to telephone the doctors, and what it's actually like to be on a first date, or, what it's actually like to be in a classroom, because I can see it all in my research and in other people's research. So I'm in favour of trying to cut through these narratives as much as we can, but it is really hard.
Wow. Look, speaking of conversations, this has been fascinating. I would love to continue to keep talking to you, but we have to call time on it. So firstly, to say thank you so much for all the things that prompted me to contact you in the first place. Your Twitter feed is a joy. I mentioned to you before, there's some wonderful pictures there, which just sort of a lovely in between, some fascinating insights and thoughts on how things are being managed and the sorts of communications that we've talked about there. So I will put a link to that. I'll put a link to your book and your research in the show notes as well, so people can dive into this topic. But it's been an absolute pleasure, and I love the clear passion that you have for what you do. And I think the fact that you described how you came into it, that there wasn't a slot waiting to be filled, you had to sort of create it and build it for yourself, and that just screams through in everything you say. So if there's one thing I'll take away, it's that we've got somebody here who's really passionate, doing really, really important work, and I've learned a heck of a lot. So thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Liz for appearing, and to you for listening. For links to Liz's book, Talk, The Science of Conversation, her research, the TED Talk she referenced, and a whole lot more, do have a look in the show notes. Quick reminder that leaving 5-star reviews for the show on your platform of choice really does help the show to grow by reaching new listeners and allowing me to continue to attract high-quality guests. If you've left a review, thank you. If you haven't, then I'd really appreciate it if you could. For more human risk-related content, do have a look at human-risk.com. You'll find details there of video blogs, and the Human Risk newsletter. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, please stay safe, have some great conversations, and thanks again for listening.